What options are left on the table now to save Ukrainian lives?
Well, look, this is the third Foreign Affairs Council we've had in a week, and I expect we'll have another one in the next few days. We're not signing off on a new package of sanctions today, but that's clearly underway, and I suspect will be agreed in the early days of next week. Today, really, I think, is about a show of unity and engagement that involves the EU, the US, Canada, and the UK. And I think it's really about sending a very clear message to the world that we in the European Union and other partners are really disgusted and outraged by what we continue to see day after day in Ukraine, and Russia's actions, which clearly are a breach of international law. I don't think there's any credible argument now that war crimes aren't being committed on a daily basis. Civilians being targeted, civilian areas being targeted, and of course last night the largest nuclear facility in Europe also targeted as Russia's looked to overcome Ukrainian resistance there. So I think what we'll see is some very strong statements today and a determination to work together to ensure that we continue to isolate Russia internationally and not just in Europe. And to send a very clear message to Moscow that this simply isn't acceptable, and to increase the calls for a ceasefire and an end of hostilities and a return to political dialogue and diplomacy.
Has that attack on a nuclear facility, has that increased the urgency for action at all? Has it changed the calculation?
Well, I mean, I think we've called for, and others have called for, an emergency session of the UN Security Council today on that particular issue. We're also looking for agreement at UN Security Council level on the humanitarian response needed into Ukraine, which involves safe humanitarian aid corridors and so on. There's I think the targeting and the violence and the fire at this nuclear facility, I think, raised a new red flag, if you like, in relation to this conflict, that this is not just about Ukraine and Russia. It's about all of us who live on the continent of Europe, who could potentially be impacted by an accident or a breach of that facility that obviously could release radiation that would be multiples of the volume and size of what happened at Chernobyl. And I think that has added a sense of urgency on that particular issue. But look, the main issue here is the brutality and the violence and the unnecessary conflict here that Russia continues to wage on its neighbour, which is also our neighbour. And we see repeatedly the Ukrainian president calling for peace talks, calling for dialogue, calling for a ceasefire to try to protect his own citizens. And those calls being rejected time and time again, or at least met with silence, I should say, to be more accurate, from the Kremlin, which is really inexplicable.
If I could, Minister, there's a real discrepancy between sanctions imposed by the EU and those in the UK. On the EU side, many hundreds of individuals named. On the UK side, a few dozen. They're giving weeks of warning of lead-in times before the seizure of assets, whereas that's already happening in places like Germany and France. Yeah. What's the risk here of assets escaping in the UK? They need to take a lot tougher line, right? I mean, after all, that's the heart. London is the heart of dirty money.
Well, look, I mean, this is why we meet at forums like this one, so that foreign ministers can talk to each other, to understand each other's perspectives. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of unity, actually, in terms of how the world is now isolating Russia and how targeted sanctions are really going to bite, so that Russian people can realize, the outrage that their leadership is causing by the decisions that they're taking in Ukraine. I mean, don't forget, the UK have led on certain sanctions. Actually, they've done some things before the EU. But certainly on in terms of the sanctioning of business people and oligarchs and Russian politicians, the EU has certainly led the way on that, and I suspect that'll be part of the conversation today.
You said that there was a red flag when it comes to the facility. Is this changing anything in the way that Ukraine should be held? Like, does this involve like more involvement of the West or the
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the targeting of a nuclear facility, particularly one of this size and scale, of course, raises a new red flag, is what I said. Unfortunately, there are many red flags that have been raised in recent days. You know, the brutalizing and targeting of civilian areas outside of Ukrainian cities, the images we see of apartment blocks in working class areas outside of cities with half of buildings gone in smouldering rubble. The unfortunate and dramatic images that we've seen of charred bodies on the streets. You know, these are war crimes. And we have one of the world's most powerful countries responsible for them in the heart of Europe. And so there are many red flags, unfortunately, that have been raised. But from the feedback that we've got in terms of what Russia has been saying, both on and off the record, unfortunately, it looks like we're going to see more of this in the coming days and weeks. The picture looks very bleak and very dark in terms of Russia's intentions. There doesn't seem to be any willingness to discuss a ceasefire, to discuss a pulling back out of residential areas. And so I think there's huge concern, and there's no point in sugarcoating that. And we are meeting today to discuss how we can impact on the mindset of those in the Kremlin who seem hell-bent on continuing to brutalize their neighbors through a war that I think is going to change history, unfortunately, on this continent. But look, our focus from an Irish perspective is to do everything we can in terms of using all the levers that we have as a member of the European Union, as a member of the UN Security Council, as a member of the United Nations, to try to work with countries. And most countries are like-minded on this. And we were reminded of that this week when there was a vote in the UN General Assembly when only 4 countries supported Russia. And they were, you know, Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, and I can't remember the fourth one, but it wasn't a country that you're likely to line up with in terms of foreign policy. So that is how isolated Russia and the Kremlin are right now. And we need to continue to force that isolation through sanctions and through international politics to try and bring this madness to an end that has already driven 1 million people out of Ukraine into their neighbours. So thank you very much.
Thank you. No, Minister, you've got to go.
I have to go. Thank you. I think what we'll see is some very strong statements today and a determination to work together. Humanitarian response needed into Ukraine, which involve an accident or a breach of that facility that obviously could release, with silence I should say, to be more accurate, from the Kremlin, which is really